We've finished the communications exercise Black Swan 21. We're going to take a look at the exercise design, how it went, and what we are going to do to improve our capability for emergency communications by radio. Stick around.
Black Swan, Black Swan.
Today we're going to look at the Black Swan 21 exercise, and I want you to take 4 things away from it. The first of which is to understand what the Black Swan COMEX series is all about, understand the features that we had this year, and understand the results from this year's operation, and then to identify opportunities for improvement. First of all, the purpose of the Black Swan communications exercise is to engage with radio operators in a way that is going to be realistic. We want for operators from local, state, and federal agencies and from non-government organizations working with them to be able to work together as if infrastructure has been compromised in a way that they would have to in a disaster, for example. The idea is that you fight like you train. You are not really going to be able to operate in emergency conditions unless you create them in order to have the training necessary to perform well when you find yourself in the position. A lot of the training that we have in amateur radio is all about just checking into a net, not really doing much else. The idea of emergency communications is very abstract, and not a lot of people understand exactly what that means, except to have the radio on. A lot of the systems that we have in amateur radio are not well understood. The way for organizing volunteers, the way for being able to support communications, and so on. All of these things are vague and abstract in the minds of operators, which then leads us to a problem of performance simply not being there. We don't have a viable product that an agency or another NGO is going to rely on. Very often, amateur radio is seen as an experiment, not an operation. Radio operators also have very little coordination in many cases in these exercises, making their own messages up, making their own scenarios in uncoordinated and sometimes nonsensical ways. That's the purpose of Black Swan, is to address those kinds of issues when it comes to creating an opportunity for exercise and for learning. Black Swan is learning by doing, operating in realistic conditions and with realistic emergency needs. If we take a look at the exercises that we've conducted over the past several years, we can see that there is a progression where each year is focused on something a little bit different that helps us to test all of the different aspects of amateur radio and emergency operations. In 2017, we began Black Swan exercise series, and in this case, we were focused on the use of 5 megahertz, the 60-meter channels that are for interoperability. Those primarily belong to U.S. government operations, but amateur radio has a secondary allocation there so that it's possible for amateur radio and government stations to be able to interoperate on the same channel. That was our focus in 2017, and we were successful in doing that. We moved on then to 2018 in having a more formalized exercise planning and play process. We created templates that were used by local participants to create their own concepts of operation and their own exercise plans. That became something that we moved on to the following year in allowing for more organic play to be developed. The idea being that stations and organizations would be aware of each other in play, had the ability to play off of one another, but they were able to create their own local events, their own local injects, and we were using the infrastructure and the interoperability for support of those local plays. Moving on from there, we went to Black Swan 20, and that was where we had regional infrastructure failure, overwhelming the population centers, requiring statewide coordination using amateur resources. So, for example, where we would have a large disaster scene, it might be near a population center like Cleveland, but it would turn out that the kinds of resources that were necessary to support that particular situation were available only in a different part of the state because there was just overwhelming of the facilities there in Cleveland, or because they needed some specialized care. So let's take a look at this year and specifically what we were doing to get ready for Black Swan 21. We did a lot of different things. We wanted to make sure that we were preparing people to be able to engage with the kind of issue that we would be facing and to be prepared for operation effectively. That preparation began almost immediately after the end of Black Swan 20. The first thing that we did was we reorganized the internet mailing list that we were using for coordination and training, and instead of being focused on just the one exercise, we created a new list that was focused on radio messaging generally. That was in November of 2020. That list is called QTC. We then moved on to NVIS Day operation in April. Our objective that we added on to the regular NVIS Day event was to have an FL message custom form and then report that to a controller so that we would get some additional information about the operation, not just being able to voice it or to use an NTS radiogram, but specifically being able to use a custom form inside of FL message. And then we moved from that in April on to May, the start of the Weather Alert Project 21. The idea there was that we were going to be originating and relaying common alerting protocol messages, and that would be mirroring what we were doing the previous year, that is with Black Swan 20, in the relay of those IPAWS messages. Also in May, we began the QSP newsletter. That's a weekly newsletter that is sourced by radio and also delivered entirely by radio. In July, we reorganized the net where we were centering a lot of our activity away from Buckeye Net Mixed, which was an NTS section net that was created for the purpose of being able to support ARES. We specifically organized Black Swan Net for the purpose of supporting the kind of operation that we were conducting in the Black Swan exercise, and specifically to support state-level agencies in particular, and any agencies at local levels that need to be able to get support from the state. In August, then, we conducted a small exercise, New Yorker 21 we called it. That was going to be structured and run just like Black Swan 21. It was kind of a dry run, giving everybody an opportunity to exercise, putting some of these skills together, and being able to deal with the kinds of conditions that we would be facing in our big exercise. During the period of August and September, we conducted an exercise we called asynchronous collaboration. In this case, we were using store and forward messaging systems like Packet BBS and also WinLink for being able to help stations to coordinate. The idea being that as long as people are checking in regularly, they're able to get alerts and find out information about what was coming and when they needed to get their stations up and running for emergency purposes. So, Black Swan 21, the overview that we had here, is going to be in the mission area of response and recovery. There were two core capabilities that we were interested in testing, one being in operational communications and the second being in operational coordination. We had 5 objectives that we were interested in exercising this year. Number 1, originate messages for radio relay. Number 2, transmit radio messages accurately, completely, and timely. Number 3, receive radio messages accurately, completely, and timely. Number 4, to deliver radio messages correctly. And number 5, organize volunteer stations to support the need at hand. In this exercise, the threat or the hazard that we were dealing with was severe weather, as often is the case when we're exercising in Ohio. Our scenario was that we had forecasts showing severe weather in the area would be bringing destructive wind and flash flooding. Agency efforts to respond and recover from such incidents were going to depend on timely communication. The sponsor was the Signal Section of the Headquarters of the 4th Civil Support and Sustainment Brigade, Ohio Military Reserve. So this was an agency exercise. The area of operations and the area of interest that we had was going to be focused in Ohio. That was the area of operation, and then the area of interest reached out a little bit further than that. The flooding that we were setting into the play scenario was going to be focused around the Ohio River, and that's what was going to be forcing evacuations. There were going to be shelters. Those were going to have overflow conditions, and so we created a need for overflow shelters well outside of the area that was affected. So we had them established near Akron and also near Dayton. This gave us the need to have evacuees being moved by bus along Interstate 77 from the affected area up to the north toward Akron, as well as Interstate 70 being able to get to the west near Dayton from the affected area. We were going to have controllers and actors engaged, and you can see those in the map here with the stations that are marked by a star, and then the stations that are marked by red were stations operating in the Shares HF service rather than in amateur radio. So our exercise control for Black Swan 21 is that we were going to have the play and the coordination and the planning siloed. Very specifically, we wanted to make sure that people involved in planning and people involved in control were separated from people that were in play. We did not want to have players to have any particular insights into what was going on. We didn't want to have any players, even if holding the information to themselves, in a situation where they knew enough that they could intuit what should happen next in a way that was unnatural. That meant that the activation of volunteers being part of the play was something that needed to be handled by the controllers directly, and that also meant that the ARES emergency coordinators could not be part of the planning and also be part of the play. We just had to keep them separate, and that's part of the doctrine for the AUXCOM program that DHS puts forth. So we structured as an AUXCOM organization in the way that we were using the volunteers rather than using an NGO partnership, and only the stations that were registered got any tasks. We were, of course, aware that ARES and NTS operations would be going in support of the simulated emergency test, so we made sure that our schedule was working around the play that we knew about, so that people wouldn't have to decide, am I going to be part of what's going on in my ARES team or part of my NTS nets, or am I going to participate in Black Swan? We made sure that we kept those organized in such a way that people could do both realistically. We wanted to make sure that we were being friendly and cooperative with everybody who was engaged in emergency communications, just as if it would happen in real life. And so that meant that we did have some conditions where we were running a net, and there would be a player from the SET that had traffic that needed to move, and we just took that as an inject in our exercise and were able to keep everything moving along. The other thing that we did to ensure that we were having some integrity in the play and avoiding people becoming confused was that we created separate channels for control of the exercise and play of the exercise. Of course, when we have everybody all together, it's very easy for somebody in a jacket of a particular color to come around, and obviously you can see that person as a controller. You understand that as a control message that you're getting, as opposed to a play message that comes from somebody else wearing a different color or no special type of jacket at all. On the other hand, our operations are distributed, as we saw, throughout the state and beyond, and so it became necessary for us to ensure that we had some separation there. We also were controlling in a way that would be possible for players to get a hold of a controller immediately if there was a problem. Internet, email, regular phone service, those all were established with the control cell so that any player would be able to get real-world messages as needed. We had all of our play messages go by radio, so those could go by WinLink, by packet BBS, and store and forward kind of systems, or they could go on the air through some kind of a net. Our control messages also had instructions for the players that were specific. They said exactly what the message is and how they were to be transmitted in terms of how urgent the message would be and so on. That kept a situation where the radio operators were able to be radio operators. We didn't have amateur radio operators thinking, oh, I need to do something else. I need to act as though I'm an incident commander, or that they have to coordinate some other resources. The players got to be radio operators, and that was a big part of what we have been trying to accomplish in the last few years, and something that we really focused on this year in the way that we structured this as an OXCOM operation. So one of the ways that we were trying to introduce some specific interoperability capability to the amateurs was to use the basic message format, the so-called 16-line radio message. We explained how that works throughout several of our exercises that we were conducting and some of the training that we were engaged in throughout the year. But in the exercise plan in particular, we had 3 appendices of note. Appendix F had a message template, Appendix G had a message sample, and Appendix H showed how to encapsulate an ICS Form 213 general message into the basic message, the 16-line radio message. Synchronous and asynchronous messaging was taking place in this exercise. So we had our Black Swan net schedule, and then we were also using WinLink for being able to move messages between stations known to be active, whether that was because they checked into a particular net or because we had coordinated that with particular operating hours. We were able to make both of those work. People, again, did not have to make a lot of choices about one thing versus another. We simply coordinated through whatever means made the most sense for that station in exercise play. So our net activation was straightforward. We put a notice out that called the net to a state of activity. The structure for that activation is in a standard 5-paragraph order that is common in military and government organizations. It includes a brief statement of what's happening and the mission at hand, and then the execution, how we're supposed to go about getting that mission accomplished, as well as how to support the mission through administration, and then control how to make sure that we understand who is accountable for getting it all taken care of. The complete activation was about 2.5 pages long if you print it out, and that is available in the same place that we always have it on the Black Swan net, on an activation page. So even now there is a page for activation that shows our regular weekly operations, but anytime that there is any kind of a special operation, something that we're running an exercise for, or something that's really happening, that activation is published on the same page, and it's in the same format so everybody can understand what to look for and how to engage. Here's an example of a bulletin that we pushed. This would be an example of the bulletin that was sent in play. We're able to see that it came from Black Swan is the name of the station. It's got a number. ZEU is the operating signal to indicate that it is a test message. This one in particular shows that it is from the situation unit leader and to the stations that follow. Spells out this is an exercise, establishes that we do have a situation unit now and that this is where the messages are to be routed. So players would see this and they would have this information that was able to help them to develop an understanding of what was going on in the exercise. Now our control messages were sent to stations individually, as the example that we have here. This is an example of one that we sent to Guernsey County. It includes contact information for the control cell. It has links for how to get additional information about the operation that we are conducting. It also has information about the station for whom these instructions are and the time of those instructions. In case something got out of sync somehow, it would be possible to see when these instructions would be applicable. So the details that we had were all about, in the control message, explaining to the player what was going on, developing that understanding further, building on what came out of the bulletins, and making sure that the players had the appropriate pointers to be able to get those tasks taken care of. In this particular case, we are giving the instructions, and we spell out, take a look at the X plan, Appendix F, Appendix G, and then we spell out, radio operators do not create the content generally. You're receiving those messages from command staff. You're going to be transmitting on their behalf, and then you're going to be receiving radio messages coming in and then deliver them to ICS command staff. So reminding everybody in the beginning exactly what they're doing, making sure that they understand their role in exercise play. And then attached to a control message might be an example of the message that the controller would be handing to them. So in this case, we took an ICS Form 213, a general message form, and it's all filled out. We spell out all of the details that are coming from the planning section chief for Black Swan in that county, and it's going to the situation unit leader, the CITL, for Task Force Black Swan 21. So all of this information is being given to the player, and the player's job then is just to engage with the message, to follow the instructions, and to do the radio stuff. So how did it go? Well, when we take a look at the core capability and the performance that we had in there, we can go through each of the 5 objectives that we set forth, and we have this judged on a scale where we have unable to be performed, performed with major challenges, which means that we did get the task done, but we had to go outside of our normal operating procedure. It created some kind of a hazard, or it created some kind of an impact on other parts of the operation. Performed with some challenges means that we did have some difficulty getting it done, but we were able to do so in a way that operated within the procedures that we have without creating any kind of an additional impact on other parts of the exercise. And then, of course, performed without challenges means that we've got the task done, and it was able to be done largely as expected. Our performance for the 5 tasks you can see here: originating messages for radio relay correctly, that was performed with major challenges. Performed without challenges, we had the transmission, the receipt, and delivery of radio messages insofar as we tested them in this exercise. And then performed with some challenges were the organization of volunteers to support the need. We can talk a little bit about that in some detail. The origination of messages for radio relay, we scored that as a partial capability. There were 3 strengths that we noted in the exercise. One is the use of available training material. That was good. The use of available information technology, so software, for example, was used well. And then, of course, there was the appetite for training and improvement. That is absolutely huge for being able to get jobs like this done, and to be able to follow up on an exercise to make sure that we are going to be able to get things done, as opposed to having a rigid mindset where I've been taught one thing and that's all that I'm going to do. Now, an area for improvement that comes up in this context is the use of the message formats to prepare messages for correct delivery. So as an example, an early instruction as we started things up in the beginning was a controller message that said, send the message so that the receiving site will get it in 3 hours or under. Now, all of the messages that we observed that were coming back in had the precedence of routine or unset, which then means it defaults to routine. Now, the way that routine messages are handled is that our expectation is that they will be delivered in 3 hours or more. It could even be the start of the next working day. And so that's an issue that we were not able to get them formatted in such a way that we could have the ability to see what's going on, to get the operator to understand how to prioritize it, and then to move it appropriately. Nevertheless, the messages were formatted for relay, that there were just some issues with getting them so that they would be on time and so on. Now, there's one thing from the after action report that I want to point out specifically, and that is that criticism of volunteers for failing to perform tasks that they've not been trained to do is unfair. It's inappropriate. And this is an area that the ARRL and agencies both have largely failed to do well. And so we commend each of the participants in the exercise for getting out there a little bit past their comfort zone, past the training that is largely accepted outside of what we're doing in this particular exercise. So this is, like any good exercise, a no-fault learning environment. So we're not busting anybody's chops for using routine when they needed to get a message there in under 3 hours, but it is something that we noted, and also we were able to point that out so that operators were able to make corrections along the way, which was very nice. Now, the transmission of radio messages, that was a full capability as we tested it. So again, our strengths come first. That would be the use of efficient net procedures. Activity on the Black Swan net was handled quite nicely. Also, there was good use of the WinLink global radio email system, and so that helped to make sure that transmission did go well. We did not identify any areas for improvement as far as we created the structure of the exercise and the kinds of things that we were testing for. We didn't have any areas for improvement. I would expect that in future years, we're going to crank things up a little bit, and that will create some more opportunity for some more training. But as far as we tested this year, we didn't see any problem. The same thing is true for the receipt of radio messages as well. Moving on to the delivery of radio messages, that's where we take the message from radio form and make sure that it gets to the person who needs the information in the form that they're able to consume it. We had two strengths. The first is the use of messaging standards. That was handled very nicely. Where we said to use an ICS 213, people were using an ICS 213. There are standards for those things, and we were able to handle that nicely. The second strength was that we were having people use software that supported those messaging standards. Again, this was a full capability as far as we tested, so we didn't see anything for the players, but there was something that we noted for the planners that we'll be using in subsequent years here. That is that we did not have players that were able to be dedicated to receiving these messages and then delivering them to somebody outside of the communications unit. So hopefully when we're able to get more people face-to-face, that kind of thing, that'll present an opportunity for us to have an agency person who is going to be receiving these messages, who's not necessarily radio savvy, and that's going to help us to make out some additional details about how somebody actually makes the delivery. Do they send it by a local email? Do they print the thing out? Is it a PDF? How exactly does that delivery get done? That's the kind of thing that we'll be building up next year. Again, this year, as far as we tested it, this was a full capability. Our last item is in the organization of volunteer stations to support the need, and this was rated as a partial capability. Three strengths that we had here are that the players did use the exercise plan with the details needed for the player's reference. We had what they needed. They could and in fact did go back and see what was in there in order to get the tasks taken care of. So the players were also able to use the net activation, understood the intent, the purpose, and the plan for how the net would be working, and the engagement with the instructions to the players and having that separated from exercise messages helped to avoid any confusion, that kind of thing that has come up in previous years. We did notice that there was an area for improvement in two areas. One was the small number of participants. We don't know exactly why we had a small number of participants. It might simply have been that people are following the training, but they don't feel like they really want to get too much into it. They're intimidated by these very formal sounding procedures, We really don't know. There was an interesting question that came up during play, though, and that is someone asked if we have some kind of a separation that's taking place in the amateur radio service between what's going on in Aries, for example, and what's happening with our work at the agency. And the answer is no, we're not splitting anything at all. We are specifically trying to make sure that we are coordinating, that we are cooperating, that we're not splitting resources. Nevertheless, the whole purpose of having programs where people train for emergency communications is so that when an agency has a need, the agency is able to get that need served. And so as an agency, we were operating in such a way that we were going to satisfy the communications requirements of our scenario. The second is that we had limited engagements by players. We did have several net control operators, that's good. We had a few more net control operators who had practiced with us in the months leading up to the exercise, but when it came time for Black Swan 21 to run, we didn't have as many as we might have had otherwise. Now, there's a part of this that also could have something to do with how people are engaged in their local Aries programs and the fact that people wanted to play in the simulated emergency test that was taking place at the same time. That could also be an area that caused people not to jump too deeply into the exercise play this year. We don't exactly know what was going on there, but those are areas that we noted. Now, we don't need to have 100 or 1,000 operators. Based on what we've been able to see, if we had a force of even a dozen, that could be tremendously powerful, even a game changer when it comes to the way the communication can operate inside of a disaster scenario that covers a good part of the state. So that's what the evaluators thought. What do the players actually think? Well, we sent out to the players a survey, a Hotwash, that allows us to get their perspective. So we asked the first question, how did you like being able to focus on the radio operator stuff instead of having to create, play content as if you're working as a member of staff or command? We had 7 responses. 5 gave a 5, that is the top score, liked focusing on that stuff, and 2 gave a 4 out of 5 for focusing there. So clearly that's something that is highly favored and something that we'll be continuing to do as we continue on with more exercises. The next question was whether the exercise control information was clear, heavily tilted in the favor of clarity. We didn't have any neutral and we didn't have any negative scores on that front. We did ask the question whether you read the X-plan, the exercise plan, before the play began. 86% said yes, 14% said no. Did you refer to the X-plan during exercise play? 71% did, 29% did not. We asked the question whether the appendices on message structure and the examples in the X-plan were helpful, and that was rated heavily in favor of a strong yes. It's very interesting to me to see how these scores break down. We might take a look at something like this and see, oh, well, we had people not even attempting to report into the net. Well, as it turns out, we had players that were outside of the range of 5 megahertz during the day, outside of the range of 3.5 megahertz in the evening, and so, of course, there would be some players who did not attempt something. Some that did try, but were able to do so only with difficulty. Others were able to do it with ease. By going through this, we're able to get a nice idea at a high level how many things were people simply not trying, how many things were people trying, and how were they succeeding. We also asked a question about participation in the preparatory efforts, the Weather Alert Project 21, the QSP newsletter, the QTC mailing list, the Black Swan net operations that we've been conducting 3 times a week since July, our COMEX for asynchronous collaboration, our COMEX for New York of 21, and we were able to see that stations have different operating schedules, they have different times that they're able to operate, they have different skills that they're able to use, and different skills they need to brush up on. So everybody made their own choices about what they were going to do in preparation, based on their time, based on their need, and this is how things break down. The question about having the control messages being sent separately through internet email as opposed to the exercise play messages, which were coming by radio. 71% did appreciate that, and 29% said that monitoring the email and also the radio was not difficult, but they would have preferred to see them together. We asked everyone how they participated in the exercise. In this case, we found that almost half of the respondents, it's not important at all that the exercise is sponsored by an agency. That's interesting to me. Roughly half, again, the same number, they're neutral, right in the middle, with only one respondent who would prefer sponsorship by an agency for an exercise. So the point of the conduct of an exercise, of course, is not just to be able to review the action afterward, but to develop an improvement plan. And this is no different. So we identified the use of message formats to prepare messages for correct delivery was an area for improvement from the examination of our performance in Black Swan 21. The corrective action that we are looking to take, number one, is that we're going to have to articulate models for how we engage with radio volunteers, how we task the requirements, making sure that they understand what it is that they need to do. And that's a planning function we really need to address. Secondly, on that same area is that we need to develop message format training material. We need to get that material out in front of people, and we need to have them engage with it so that they are trained to use these various standards. As radio operators, they need to understand radio messages, radio message formats, to choose the right ones, and then to select the right options inside of them to get the intent of the message originator, of the served agency, of the organization actually implemented. Third, we are going to need to sponsor exercises for the volunteers. We're going to need to score and recognize them for their engagement and for their achievement. This is going to allow us to follow through. So we've created the model, we've created the training, and then we can practice the training. Those three elements are all going to be necessary for improvement in the use of those message formats. When it comes to the number of participants and the limited engagement, that's going to have to be all about operating a program that is specifically designed to recruit, to train, and to exercise radio volunteers so that they understand the mission at hand and they're able to address those mission needs. So there's work to be done. While that work is being done, I want to make sure that we've thanked everybody who has been participating with us. Whether you've been actively engaged in participating in everything, whether you've been participating in some things as you have the availability, or whether you've just been sticking your toe in the water, or even just watching to see what's happening, we appreciate your attention and your time. Amateur radio is a very powerful force multiplier for community resilience, but it is so only as far as we train. And so that's why it's so important that we do this work to be viable in the time that we are most needed. So the 4 things that you can do while we are taking care of some of those things that are in the improvement plan. Number 1 is to tell others about your experience in the operation. If you enjoyed it, tell other people about it. Tell them what you enjoyed about it. And also help others who have interests that are also aligned and that they have a willingness to participate, to get engaged, and to be able to develop those same kinds of skills that you have. Continue in our normal operations. We've got the QTC mailing list is still going on, the Black Swan Net is still running, and the QSP radio newsletter is still running. So that said, be on the lookout for when those improvements are starting to make their way out and be ready to engage with them. If you've got any questions or comments for me, you are, of course, always welcome to contact me. You can do so by WinLink at KD8TTE or by internet KD8TTE at pm.me. And that is the Black Swan 21 After Action Report and Improvement Plan. Thanks very much for watching, and we look forward to seeing you soon. This is Radio KD8TTE, out.